Well, a very good morning indeed, and welcome to the first of a series of 6 programmes on Manx Radio on our island heritage, where we're going to look at the history of the Isle of Man. We're delighted to be able to say that on each programme we'll be joined by the Director of the Manx Museum and National Trust, Mr. Marshall Cubbon. Mr. Cubbon, welcome indeed to this new series.
Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you and your listeners to the Manx Museum itself for the first programme. And I think it's very fitting that Manx Radio should be doing a series such as this.
Could I ask you, before we start going into the details, a little bit about the Manx Museum itself? How long has the Manx Museum been formed?
Well, the story really goes back to the end of the last century. In 1886, Tynwald passed an act setting up a body called the Manx Museum and Ancient Monuments Trustees. For many years there was in fact no museum as such, but the trustees were building up collections against the day when there was to be a national museum for the Isle of Man. Later on, at the beginning of the century, temporary accommodation was provided in one of the rooms in Castle Rushen, but the Manx Museum proper opened just over 50 years ago in 1922 in the building that most Manx people will know near the top of Crellins Hill, which was the former Nobles Hospital, the first Nobles Hospital. It is perhaps interesting to note that the foundation stone of that building as the hospital was actually laid in 1886, the very year of the Act of Tynwald setting up the Manx Museum Trustees.
And I do know for a fact that especially in the summer months you have literally thousands and thousands of people coming to the museum, don't you?
Oh, indeed, yes. The summer is our busy time, of course, in terms of total numbers. We now have an annual visitation. It's been going up quite steadily, and we now have something like 110,000 people a year through the Manx Museum. Of course it is during the summer months that we get our high attendance returns. That's not surprising, of course, when you think of the number of tourists that the Isle of Man gets compared with the resident population. And really, I suppose the museum has got a dual role to play. It should aim to present a picture of the Isle of Man to the summer visitors during the summer months in particular. And of course then it should also seek to serve the local Manx community, especially out of season.
Yeah. Well, that's a very brief history of the museum, but can we go into programme number 1? And obviously we start at the very beginning, the first traces of man in the Isle of Man. Could you tell us a little about this to start?
Well, yes, here we are in the prehistoric gallery of the Manx Museum. There were 2 archaeology galleries, and the first one begins with the traces of the earliest man of mankind, that is, in the Isle of Man, of which we have records. These are tiny little flint implements, not much longer than your fingernail, and not as wide as that.
Well, what sort of period of time would this be?
Well, it's a very good question, but it's a difficult one to answer precisely. In round figures, it's something like 5,000 to 6,000 BC. Unfortunately, up to date, we have not got a site in the Isle of Man that has enabled us to date this Middle Stone Age, as we call it, this Middle Stone Age culture more precisely. We, of course, do live in hopes that one day we might get an actual settlement site with perhaps traces of a hearth inside a hut or something of this kind, which would enable us to get a radiocarbon date for that particular hearth. And if and when that happens, I'll be able to answer your question a bit more precisely.
Well, where exactly did they come from, and how did they get to the Isle of Man? Did they come by boat, or how was it?
Yes, well, they said they were certainly spreading up from, well, originally from continental Europe, as we call it now, into Britain, and spreading northwestwards to eventually to the Isle of Man. The point about whether they came by boat or not is a good one. It is, I think they probably did come by boat, but it is just possible that the first settlers might have got here dry shod, as it were. They might have walked here. In other words, they might have got here before the Isle of Man was actually separated off from what is now Britain by the rising sea level that was a feature of conditions after the end of the Great Ice Age, the sort of period that we're talking about.
In fact, the whole of the British Isles were one solid mass of land then, weren't they?
That's right, and the British Isles was in fact joined on to continental Europe too. It was this rising sea level that broke through the sort of English Channel and Straits of Dover area to make Britain a separate island from continental Europe, and eventually Ireland was separated off as a separate island, and later again the Isle of Man was separated off on the basis of the depth of the seas around the island. It seems very clear that the last land connection between the Isle of Man and Britain would have run out eastwards to the Lake District. And it is just possible that connection was broken sufficiently late to allow the first settlers to move in. But actually, I think the odds are rather against that.
Yeah.
I think they probably did have to cross the seas, but they wouldn't be perhaps as wide seas as they are today.
Yeah. Fine, so that's how they arrived, and if we move along, I think you have some more fine exhibits here, and this, I noticed from your map, includes basically just Northern Ireland and the Isle of Man.
Yes, this is another type of flint implement, much larger and more robust than the little tools of the Middle Stone Age people. And this, again, they relate to a people that are only known really in the north of Ireland and the Isle of Man. They're called the Bann River people, after the River Bann in Northern Ireland. And to get to the Isle of Man from there, they certainly would have had to cross the seas, because the sea is much deeper westwards of the Isle of Man than it is eastwards. These people, I may say, the same as the Middle Stone Age folk, were hunter-fishermen. They didn't know anything about farming, and in consequence they were probably nomadic people that didn't have permanent homes. They'd have to move camp from time to time, following the animals that they were hunting.
Does this mean that some people sort of came from the English side, and the Bann people came from Ireland, so there were two races sort of converging even then?
Well, yes, though the Bann movement was later, in fact, later in time than the first Middle Stone Age settlement that came in from the southeast. But certainly people of a different culture. The word race is a bit difficult,
yes.
And we frankly just don't know precisely whether they were a different race or whether they just learned to make their tools in a rather more sophisticated way, or whatever.
Yeah. Talking of tools, would that be the ideal time now to walk across to your other display cabinet here, Man the Tool Maker?
Yes, this is a little display we've put on to really illustrate how the development of tools took place during prehistoric times. It is really the use of tools that is one of perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of man, as distinct from any other animal. And there are perhaps one or two extremely rarefied instances of animals using a tool. But normally it is man's capacity to actually take a piece of stone, or later on a piece of metal, and fashion it into a tool with which he could do specialized jobs that did separate him out from the animal kingdom. And it was a very slow and gradual process, of course, in the early times, but it's one of the essential features of man's development.
I notice here that you have sort of the flint axe head, which is not polished at all, one slightly polished, and then the very highly polished.
Yes, well, this of course does illustrate improving technology, if you like. I must stress again the slowness of development compared with modern technological change, but it was a slow, steady evolution of technical progress, and that the axe head, in many points of view, can be regarded perhaps as the basic tool of the early settlers, because we mustn't picture the Isle of Man as we know it today. In prehistoric times, virtually all the lowland of the island anyway, and much of the hills indeed too, the experts tell us, would have been covered by woodland, quite thick woodland. And one of the problems facing early man was to actually to have the capacity to clear the woodland in order to have a little place to live. Later on, of course, with the coming of later peoples with knowledge of farming, once woodland was cleared, the grazing animals, the sheep and the goats and so on, would keep down fresh growth. But the actual clearing of the woodland was a very difficult task.
So really in those days, as well as being sort of joined to the British Isles as one land mass, it was completely covered in trees as well?
Yes, this is so. I mean, it's been said of Britain as a whole that in prehistoric times a squirrel could go from Land's End to Joan of Groats without ever touching the ground.
Fine. Well, can we move on now possibly and have a look coming into the New Stone Age, where again we can see a different sort of approach altogether, can't we?
Yes, well, this is a big step forward. The New Stone Age peoples again moved up from the southeast, from continental Europe originally, and they brought a whole body of new ideas. In particular, they were the first farmers. They knew how to keep cattle, and they knew how to grow grain. And they also developed these very beautifully polished stone axe heads that were an indication of their ability to begin to make an inroad into the tree cover.
Yeah. What sort of period in time? I know it's difficult to ask these dates. What would we be talking about?
Yes,
the New Stone Age?
Now we're talking about perhaps 2,500 through to 2000 BC.
Yeah.
That kind of period. The other characteristic of the New Stone Age settlers was their method of burying their dead. They constructed these tombs of vast, great stones. Perhaps the finest example here in the Isle of Man is the site known as Cache Leonard in Macheld, and where a great long cairn of stone and earth originally covered in a burial chamber which was used for successive burials, really a sort of family vault kind of idea, dating, as I say, for about 2500 BC.
And the next improvement then, I would imagine, if we move on, would come to the Bronze Age. And what sort of people were these now? Were these sort of just descendants of the early?
No, I think again it was a case of new people coming in with again new technological knowledge, the knowledge of actually using metal and being able to cast in bronze. There was probably mixture with the earlier population. Well, of course, these questions concerned with date and race and so on are very difficult, because, of course, you must remember that the periods that we've been talking about are all long before the days of written record. And so we only really have the evidence of the archaeology, the actual objects and sites in the ground, and these can tell us a lot, but they can't answer all the questions, of course. In particular, they can't answer questions that relate to what were the thoughts in people's minds. We don't know what their religious ideas really were. For example, we have their burial sites. From this, it seems reasonable to suppose they were believing in some kind of afterlife. But what their religious ideas really were, we don't know, because we haven't got records.
Yeah. Well, where were the original sort of, we call the Bronze Age, because obviously the bronze has started to be used now in weapons. Where would the bronze come from? Possibly the Eastern countries being brought through?
Well, no, I think actually rather the other way around. The technological breakthrough, the working of the development of metallurgy and so on, that really took place in the Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East sort of area. But then following that, traders spread out from that region looking for the raw materials, looking in particular for tin, which was a rare commodity. And it seems, partly at least, as if it was the development of trade by prospectors, miners perhaps even, we might think, that brought knowledge of this new material, this new workable metal, westwards eventually to Britain and to the Isle of Man.
Yeah. Well, would it be a difficult question to ask you now, at this period in time, would the island be sort of forming itself into the shape as we know it today?
Yes, well, basically the shape of the island would have been unchanged throughout prehistoric times. The vegetation cover, as I've mentioned, this varies, but the actual shape of the hills and so on, that can be regarded more or less as a fixture in terms of the archaeological period. Of course, going back much further, there'll be geological changes, but during this period of time when mankind has been around in the Isle of Man, the general shape of the island is as we know it today.
Yeah. The next age you would go on to, a natural follow-on, would this be the Iron Age? And again, what period are we talking of now?
The Iron Age, we think, began here perhaps about 500 BC or so, again, talking in terms of round dates. And it was the arrival of new people that brought with them knowledge of working iron as distinct from bronze. These new people, in fact, were the Celts. At last we're getting to people that we can give a name to, even though it's a general composite sort of name like the Celts, because we're getting on to the period when the classical writers in Rome and elsewhere were actually writing things down, and they refer to these Celtic tribes that were occupying northern Europe at that time. And it was these Celtic Iron Age peoples that spread to the Isle of Man, as I say, perhaps about 400, 500 BC.
What was the biggest difference or advantage that the people, the Celts, found by being able to use iron as opposed to the bronze of the previous sort of hundreds of years?
Yeah, well, the great thing was that iron is relatively plentiful, and once the capacity of actually smelting iron was achieved, metal tools for the first time could become widespread. Back in the Bronze Age, there were such things as bronze axe heads and so on, but it was principally used for weaponry for the chiefs and the princes and the well-to-do. Iron was providing the ordinary, everyday person, the basic farmer, if you like, with a means of doing his job more efficiently. And it's these Celtic Iron Age peoples that really cleared the woodland cover of the Isle of Man.
Which gives me a perfect cue, in actual fact, to move to the next display you have here, the home of a Celtic chieftain, and just looking at the number of trees that there must have been in there, I would think they'd pretty well clear a forest just for that, wouldn't they?
Well, yes, this is quite an impressive model of this timber-framed Celtic chieftain's house. It's a very interesting model. It results from an excavation that was carried out during the last war, when famous and very highly skilled German archaeologist was in fact interned in the Isle of Man. And later in the war, he was allowed out with small parties of internee volunteers under armed guard to carry out a number of very important archaeological excavations in the island. And one of the most important was at this site at Ballackagan, just about a mile northwest of Castletown, in the marshy floodplain of the Dum River. And there he excavated, in fact, 2 houses of this sort, and then a third site at Ballinarvis, a little to the northwest. And the model that we've got here shows what one of these houses must have looked like when it was in use. The excavators actually found traces, very substantial traces, of timber still surviving in the ground. The fairly wet, waterlogged conditions were very good for, in fact, preserving organic material like timber, which normally would rot away. And from this, it's been possible to do a very detailed reconstruction. And this model was actually built in the internment camp by another of the internees under the personal supervision of Dr. Berso, the director.
This sort of has most of the area covered where the people would be living, not just sort of the chieftain and family.
No, this really would be, I suppose, the equivalent of a substantial farm of today. A well-to-do farmer with his family, perhaps 20 or 30 people might have been living in the house of this sort. As you see, it's a low sort of circular structure, dome structure, rather like a saucer turned upside down, you might say. The whole thing composed, the whole framework composed of substantial timbers, and those timbers originally supported a roof that was formed of sods. And you see there's a little wattle fence running around the outside of the house. Traces of this were found in the excavation. That wasn't there to keep the enemies out. It wouldn't have done that job very effectively anyway. That was primarily there to stop the cows climbing on the roof to eat the grass that was growing there and breaking the roof in the process. Yeah.
So during this sort of the Celtic times here, we now are on to sort of farming more than previous.
Yes, because of the iron tools, basically, the woodland could be cleared substantially, and as you rightly say, there's obvious proof of this in the enormous number of timbers, substantial timbers that were incorporated in these houses. Dr. Berso estimated, I think, that in one of his houses alone there were over 1,000 mature oak trees. So that this is really very telling evidence for the widespread clearance of the woodlands, and this would be associated with farming, particularly cattle farming, that the Celts were good at.
Well, the next stage, I would imagine, Mr. Cubbon, would be the early Christianity. They're sort of following on, or including still part of the Iron Age.
Yes, that's right. The Iron Age Celtic peoples here in the Isle of Man adopted Christianity probably about the 4th, 5th century. And the Isle of Man is really very rich in monuments of the early Christian period, and in particular the stone cross slabs, that is a slab of local stone with a representation of the Christian cross on it, which are in basically tombstones. They are the early Christian tombstones, and they might be regarded, if you like, as the hallmark of the early Christian period. How Christianity got to the Isle of Man is a question we're often asked. And
I was going to say I was going to ask you, and I think we're about to explode a myth, aren't we? With I think everyone believes it was St. Patrick, and St. Patrick was here, and that's why we have no snakes on the island, because he banned them.
Yes. Well, St. Patrick always appears when you talk about this period, and I don't know about exploding a myth. There may be something in it. I think there may be something in it, but it's not as simple as it's normally rendered. The first thing to remember, I think, is that St. Patrick was not an Irishman. He was the great patron saint of the Irish, of course, but he moved from the British side of the Irish Sea across to Ireland and brought Christianity to Ireland. And this is, of course, part of the general westward movement of the Celtic peoples that were occupying the whole of what is now England, when the Roman legions departed, the Romans who did not come to the Isle of Man at all, when the Romans departed from England, the Anglo-Saxons, of course, pagan Anglo-Saxons, invaded southeastern England. And simplifying really a very complicated historical period, the movement of the Anglo-Saxons into the southeast of England produced a westward movement of the Celtic peoples that had formerly been in England at the time of the Roman occupation. And this westward movement of Celts brought knowledge of Christianity, which had been in England and during the Roman Empire period, brought knowledge of Christianity westwards. So I think it's likely that this same westward movement, the same movement that led to St. Patrick going to Ireland, brought Christianity here to the Isle of Man. We don't have any records, contemporary records, to suggest St. Patrick got here. As for the snakes, I don't think they were here before St. Patrick's Day either. They just
didn't make it before the waters opened.
That's exactly it. They didn't make it before the waters cut us off. Just for the same reason. That's why there aren't snakes in Ireland, of course.
Yeah. Can we move across now, perhaps? And while we're moving, if I could ask you, I think you mentioned about St. Patrick not being here, but there is, of course, a St. Patrick's chair in the island, isn't there?
Yes, that's right. There was a great cult of Patrick in the later Middle Ages, and there is a site known as St. Patrick's Chair, and it is an early Christian site with two fine cross slabs on it, and it's quite likely that it is the grave of an early Christian saint, perhaps one of the first missionaries coming to the Isle of Man, a sort of site that the Celtic early Christian experts called a lacht. But it's certainly not St. Patrick who's there, if it is a burial.
Right. I think this here, of course, is one of the proudest exhibits you have in the museum, the Calf of Man crucifixion. Would that be right?
That's certainly so, yes. This is one of our really great treasures. I'd mentioned the early Christian crosses that were basically normally tombstones. Later, the simple cross developed, and you get the introduction of ornamentation, increasingly elaborate and increasingly sophisticated. And one of the really great pieces of carving, and when I say great pieces of carving, I'm not talking about the Isle of Man, I'm talking about Britain. Indeed, it's not too much to say European art takes note of this carving. One of the really great pieces of carving is that found on the Calf of Man 200 years ago, which is a part of a representation of the crucifixion. It's not complete, as you see, and the rest of that carving should be on the Calf of Man. The calf looks a small place when you look at a map, but when you're over there looking for the rest of it, I can assure you it seems a pretty big place.
Well, on our programme in the series next month, we'll continue from early Christian times through the Viking era up to more recent times. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank once again Mr. Marshall Cubbon, the director of the Manx Museum and National Trust, for his cooperation in making this programme possible, and hope you'll join us the same time next month for part 2 of Our Island Heritage.